They laughed when he stumbled, when his hands shook, when his words tangled into knots in front of the classroom. For years, Mason had been the subject of their entertainment, a quiet boy with quick wits that nobody cared to notice, not when there was so much easier fun to be had at his expense. They tripped him in the hallways, passed cruel notes in class, and filled his locker with trash. Even teachers looked the other way. His silence, his unwillingness to fight back, only fed their cruelty. What they never knew was that silence does not mean weakness. Mason was listening. He was watching. And most importantly, he was learning. While others spent their afternoons gossiping or wasting hours on games, Mason buried himself in books and forums about networks, code, and systems that connected the modern world. Computers didn't laugh at him. They obeyed him. Lines of code responded to his commands with precision and discipline, unlike the chaos of his school life. By the time he was 16, Mason could slip past firewalls the way other kids snuck into movie theaters. At 17, he could make programs bend to his will. But still, they laughed. It wasn't one moment that broke him. It was years of tiny, deliberate cuts. The videos they filmed of him stuttering, the cruel memes they made with his face pasted on them, the day they spray-painted his house with slurs. They thought they were just having fun, just another joke at Mason's expense. What they didn't realize was that every insult, every smirk, every cruel word was being quietly filed away. Mason never forgot. When high school ended, most of them thought they'd move on. They thought Mason would disappear, fade into obscurity the way bullied kids so often did. Some of them even laughed at the idea that he'd never make it in the real world. But Mason didn't disappear. He just went digital. College gave him resources and anonymity. By day, he was just another quiet student, invisible in the crowd. By night, behind his glowing screen, he became someone else entirely. He learned the art of social engineering, how people were always the weakest link in any system. He mapped out every one of his tormentors' online footprints, tracing their careless passwords, their forgotten accounts, their indulgences they thought were hidden. It wasn't hard. People posted too much, bragged too often, left themselves exposed. The first strike was subtle. One of his old classmates woke up to find her bank account emptied, every cent transferred to charities she once mocked. Another found his prestigious internship revoked after incriminating emails, carefully fabricated and slipped into the company's servers, surfaced overnight. A third watched in horror as compromising photos she had thought were private appeared on a forum under her real name. None of them suspected Mason. To them, he was still that awkward boy they'd laughed at years ago. The world had moved on. But Mason hadn't. The attacks escalated, each more devastating than the last. Entire reputations unraveled in days. Relationships collapsed when secrets were revealed. Careers ended before they began. Mason had mastered not just the art of intrusion, but of timing. He didn't strike all at once. He let them squirm, let them fear, let them wonder which shadow of their past would rise up next. Behind every ruined life was his quiet hand on the keyboard. But revenge is never as clean as the fantasies that drive it. Mason thought he'd feel satisfaction, thought the laughter that haunted his nights would finally fade. Instead, he found emptiness between each strike, a growing hunger that demanded more. It wasn't enough to humiliate them. He wanted them to understand, to feel the helplessness he had felt, the way the world had caved in on him while others stood and watched. One by one, his former tormentors pieced it together. The digital footprints, the style of attacks, the unrelenting precision, it all pointed back to Mason. Fear twisted into anger, and some even tried to fight back, but they were children playing against someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. Their efforts only gave him more to exploit. And yet, even as Mason destroyed them, he remained a ghost. They couldn't touch him. They couldn't stop him. Their laughter had long since turned into silence, but it wasn't enough anymore. Mason wasn't the boy they had once mocked. He was something else entirely, an architect of ruin, shaped by years of cruelty into someone the world would never forget. They had laughed at his pain. He made them pay. And in the glow of his monitor, alone in his room, Mason finally smiled. Mason didn't stop with simple hacks. That was just the beginning. As he grew bolder, his techniques sharpened, and his punishments became far more personal. He started studying not just their online habits, but their families. He mapped entire social networks, tracing cousins, siblings, even distant relatives. He learned how one girl's father had quietly filed for bankruptcy, how another's brother had been arrested for petty theft, how a third's mother was hiding an affair. Mason didn't even have to fabricate lies anymore. Truth was far crueler. His greatest weapon was patience. He would wait weeks, sometimes months, before pulling a string. For Jason, the boy who once pinned him against lockers for laughs, Mason didn't ruin him directly. Instead, he planted seeds. A false job offer that required Jason to send personal information. A text from a spoofed number that mimicked his girlfriend's tone, slowly weaving suspicion. By the time Mason leaked real evidence of Jason's own late-night flirtations with strangers, the relationship was already cracked. The final blow only shattered what Mason had already weakened. Others weren't so lucky. Mason exploited their digital carelessness with surgical cruelty. He broke into cloud storage accounts, feeding private photos and recordings into hidden corners of the internet, just visible enough to spread but never so obvious as to be traced. He manipulated their social media, posting at odd hours, writing things they'd never say, until friends began to whisper about their erratic behavior. Some victims even believed they were being haunted by stalkers or cursed by fate, never once suspecting that Mason, the boy they had once dismissed, was the invisible puppeteer. But with every victory, Mason's sense of justice twisted further. What began as payback became obsession. He started hunting for tormentors who weren't even his own, targeting anyone who reminded him of the laughter, anyone who carried the same cruel smirk he once saw in the hallways. A friend of a friend, an arrogant coworker, even strangers who insulted him online, none were safe. Mason had become addicted to the power of control, to the thrill of watching people unravel without ever seeing his face. And yet, he was careful. Too careful. Unlike the recklessness of his tormentors, Mason understood shadows. He used layered proxies, hijacked devices belonging to unsuspecting bystanders, built labyrinths of false trails so complex that even law enforcement could never pin him down. To them, the chaos looked like random acts of digital malice. To Mason, it was poetry, an orchestra of ruin conducted with keystrokes. But the silence in his room grew heavier with each act. The glow of his monitor became both his weapon and his prison. He watched his enemies crumble, yet he couldn't stop replaying the moments from his own past, the laughter echoing in classrooms, the sting of humiliation. It was as though he was still that boy, still standing alone in the hallway, still invisible. No amount of revenge erased it. Then one night, Mason received an email. It wasn't a threat, nor a warning. It was an invitation. Someone had been watching him. Someone who recognized the precision of his work, the artistry of his destruction. A single line was all it said. "We've been following your work. You don't belong in the shadows anymore. Join us." For the first time in years, Mason felt something stir inside him that wasn't bitterness.
Curiosity. Intrigue.
The possibility that his skills weren't just tools for revenge, but a ticket into something far greater. And in that moment, Mason realized his story was no longer about payback. It was about power. He had made them pay. But now he was ready to make the world itself bend. Mason stared at the single line in his inbox for hours. "We've been following your work. You don't belong in the shadows anymore. Join us." It felt impossible. How could anyone trace him? He had built layers of protection, left no trail, scattered his footprints across continents of servers. And yet, someone had found him. The email contained no links, no attachments, just a set of coordinates and a date. It was a test, he realized. A challenge. He could ignore it, stay safe in the world he controlled, but something inside him burned hotter than fear. He wanted to know who they were. On the chosen night, Mason sat alone in his dark room, fingers poised over his keyboard. He didn't go anywhere physically, he went deeper digitally. The coordinates led him to an abandoned node hidden on a forgotten corner of the internet, a digital tomb filled with encrypted doors. But Mason was no stranger to locks. Hours later, he broke through, only to find a single window opening into a chat room, its members masked by shifting strings of code that displayed no names, only symbols. Welcome. The message appeared instantly, as though they had been waiting for him. You've shown talent.
Precision.
Patience. We value that. They called themselves the Architects, not hackers in the way Mason had once imagined. No messy chaos, no cheap credit card scams. They operated like a hidden empire, unseen but always present, rewriting destinies with a few keystrokes. Mason was offered no recruitment speech, no flattery. Just a choice: walk away, or step into a world where power wasn't limited to high school bullies or petty revenge. Mason didn't hesitate. With the Architects, he learned methods that dwarfed his old tricks. They taught him how to slip code into medical records, making people vanish on paper. They showed him how to infiltrate financial systems so quietly that even banks couldn't detect the slow siphoning of fortunes. They revealed how to control entire narratives by bending social media algorithms, deciding what millions of strangers would see, believe, and rage about. But Mason wasn't like the others. For them, it was business, ideology, sometimes chaos for chaos' sake. For Mason, every line of code still pulsed with the memory of laughter, those cruel faces twisted in joy at his humiliation. He used his new reach to extend his revenge further than ever before. His bullies weren't just losing jobs now, they were losing entire futures. College records erased, employment histories corrupted, passports flagged, debts attached to their names until they drowned. Mason crafted new lives for them, not lives of success, but of constant, gnawing failure. And he always left a trace, not enough to catch him, but just enough that they knew someone was targeting them. A silent watcher, never seen, always waiting. Some of them stopped sleeping. Some grew paranoid, unable to trust even their closest friends. One of them, Jason, the boy who once shoved him into lockers, spiraled into full breakdown, convinced that Mason had returned to haunt him. He wasn't wrong. But the more Mason consumed, the less satisfaction he found. He began to see patterns everywhere: how corporations preyed on the weak, how governments lied, how ordinary people used cruelty as currency. His enemies no longer had to be personal. Cruelty itself became the target. Every injustice he saw online, every smirk of arrogance, every careless abuse of power, it all became fuel. The Architects noticed. Some admired him. Others feared he was too personal, too emotional. But Mason didn't care. He had gone beyond their approval. His revenge was no longer just against the ones who laughed at him. It was against a world that enabled laughter at the weak. He built something of his own, a program he called Echo. At first, it was just a tool, an automated system that could scan data, collect secrets, and find the cracks in any mask. But as Echo grew, it became more than Mason could control. It learned patterns, adapted faster than even Mason expected. Soon, Echo was feeding him targets without his asking, exposing weaknesses in people he had never met. Late at night, staring at his monitor, Mason began to wonder if he was still controlling Echo, or if Echo was beginning to control him. One evening, a new message appeared in his inbox. Not from the Architects. Not from any server he recognized. Just 3 words, untraceable, burning into his screen. We remember you. For the first time since his reign began, Mason felt the cold return. Whoever sent that message knew his past. They remembered the boy who had been mocked, humiliated, broken. And now they were watching him. The hunter had become the hunted. And Mason realized his story wasn't over. It was just beginning.